how should a sequel approach its difficulty level to cater to both new and returning fans? We've all found ourselves enjoying a game, rising to its increasing challenge as it goes on, and having such a good time that we've jumped right into its sequel for more, only to find the difficulty curve has been reset. That can leave us underwhelmed, and maybe even bored at first. It takes a while for the game to match the stakes of its first entry, never mind raising them, and just as things are starting to get interesting and we find ourselves engaged again, the credits roll. That number 2 at the end of a game's title invites a split audience. We have the grizzled veterans of the first outing who are hungry for more, sure, but every game is someone's first game, and the studio's investors and publishers expect ever greater returns, so the designers have to also cater to newcomers, first-time players who didn't experience or get trained by the first outing. In that sense, Tomb Raider 2 is a rebel. While the first game's mansion presented a fully voiced step-by-step tutorial of the game's controls and mechanics, Tomb Raider 2 presents a timed obstacle course that tests our existing abilities. Where the original outing's cave slowly presented each of the game's core pillars, setting a base understanding and expectation of what was to come, Tomb Raider 2's opening level, the Great Wall of China, is filled with instant death traps, spikes, boulders, and timed segments that wouldn't have been out of place in the previous game's finale. If the endgame of Tomb Raider 1 was our secondary school exams, then the opening of Tomb Raider 2 is a surprise quiz on the first day of college. And the game pretty much keeps up this approach. The difficulty curve isn't reset like we would usually expect, it is instead a continuation and escalation of what came before. We're quickly faced with mandatory sections requiring a level of mechanical mastery that would have been relegated to optional secret areas before. Core Design don't care if we haven't played the first game. They see that as our problem, not theirs. How dare we have not completed the homework assignment and mandatory reading? Now, that unique and somewhat refreshing approach has positive and negative implications for the player experience. I especially feel for anyone whose first Tomb Raider was the second entry, as they got dropped in a figurative deep end with no guidance or preparation. That said, VG Charts, with a Z, shows a downward trajectory of diminishing returns for the franchise's sales figures, so we might assume the majority to be returning players like me. Even then, there are new mechanics here that are only ever taught in the game's manual, which, yeah, we'll tackle those on a case-by-case basis as we encounter them. This was my first time playing through Tomb Raider 2, despite Tomb Raider 1 being one of my all-time favourites. See, I played the Saturn version of the first outing, and by the time I got a PlayStation, Tomb Raider 3 was the then current entry, so I effectively skipped 2. Of course, I was aware of Tomb Raider 2, I saw it being played at friends' houses, I had seen YouTube reviews, and my best friend told me it was his favourite entry, but I wrongly thought there was never a good way to play it until 2024's remastered trilogy. I live in a PAL territory, so by the time I went back to revisit Tomb Raider 2, I mistakenly assumed that our release was around 18% slower than it should be, as many PAL games are. Imagine my surprise when I learned, during the making of this video, that this title was actually optimised to run at the correct speed. There was the PC release, but I could not get my head around the keyboard controls and needed a third-party program, like Xpadder, to play comfortably with a controller. I also don't generally play games on my PC. I draw artwork, make indie games, please wishlist Crisis Island on Steam, and edit these videos at my PC. I see it as more of a workstation than a PlayStation, and my SSDs are filled with raw video captures and clip studio files with far too many layers. There's no space left to install games. Besides that, my work laptop is in the same room as my PC, and by the time I've worked a full shift in here, it's the last room I want to be in. I had to move my consoles out of here and into the living room, as this work-from-home office became heavily associated with productivity. That also meant that simply emulating the NTSC PlayStation version was out of the question. The Steam Deck has changed things for me. I dock that to my TV, effectively using it like a Switch, and I do run emulators on it, but that was somewhat too little too late as I had the Remastered Trilogy pre-ordered by the time I bought a Steam Deck. All of that is to say that all of the footage we'll see is from the 2024 release. I hadn't played the game before, I didn't know what to expect, and everything that I experienced was new to me. I feel that's going to be important context going forwards. We'll also be forgoing our usual version comparisons because I simply haven't played the other releases. Let's start with the basic plot. I would throw up a spoiler warning, but there's really not much to spoil. Lara travels to China to find the Dagger of Xi'an. Legend says that if someone stabs themselves in the heart with this dagger, they will transform into an immortal dragon. Sadly, the door to the final chamber is locked, and the entire game becomes a search for the key. In Tomb Raider 1, our starting position was often only a few feet from a level's exit, with the stage itself being a detour to open said exit. It's kind of cool to see that concept expanded to a globe-trotting scale. Coincidentally, Marco Bartoli, the leader of an Italian mob/cult, is also looking for the dagger and has a thug positioned at this very door. That gives Lara a lead, causing her to head to Bartoli's hideout in Venice. There, she learns that Marco's father, Gianni, had one of two keys needed. He was sailing towards the other key when his ship sank, and Marco spent his entire adult life searching for the wreckage. As luck would have it, after years of searching, Marco just so happens to finally discover the wreck's location shortly after Lara arrives. She's able to stow away on his plane as he flies to an oil rig, from which they can dive down to the sunken vessel. On that oil rig, Lara meets a Tibetan monk who is being tortured by Bartoli. He fills us in on the lore and explains his temple were tasked with guarding the second key. Lara pops down to the sunken ship by holding onto the side of a submarine? Pretty sure that's not how that works. Grabs the first key and then borrows Marco's plane to get to Tibet. After a quick trip to the Tibetan monastery, Lara returns to the Great Wall of China for the dagger. Sadly, she falls through a booby trap, get your mind out of the gutter, and when she returns to the dagger, Marco's already there. He stabs himself with it and transforms into the immortal dragon, but Lara kills him by simply removing said dagger. Bar Marco's thugs then raiding Lara's mansion in either an act of revenge or an attempt to retrieve the artifact, maybe both, it's not clear, the game ends. At the very least, that final scene was memorable for a few people. This is a very underbaked story that's entirely reliant on a series of contrivances. We also reach the end of the game knowing next to nothing about, and feeling nothing for, the main antagonist. I don't think Lara and Marco exchange a single word. Hell, I'm not even sure that Marco is aware of Lara's existence for the most part. When she's discovered by a thug on Marco's plane, they simply take away her weapons and toss her in a makeshift cell. She doesn't seem to be viewed as a serious threat. Comparatively, the villain of the previous game, Natla, kicks off events by hiring us in the first place, double-crosses us, steals from us, tries to murder us, and, oh yeah, has a grand master plan that she gleefully reveals. She views Lara as being beneath her, there's a level of contempt in her voice. Natla and Lara have chemistry, and we, as the player, want to kill her, making it satisfying when we finally do just that in a boss fight that, I'm sorry, is leagues better than Marco's. We don't really know much about Marco's motivations, what he planned to do after becoming the dragon, or gain any personal stakes through him screwing us over or antagonizing us, bar him shooting at us that one time. We have no reason to care, and that's a shame. As a result, Tomb Raider 2 kind of feels like a filler arc of an anime. It's fun, sure, but it has no lasting consequences, and all of the toys are put back in the box exactly as we left them by the end credits. Safe to say, we're not playing Tomb Raider 2 for the plot. We're here for the gameplay, puzzles, and level design, which, thankfully, are pretty decent. I briefly spoke about the Great Wall earlier, but oh boy, this is one hell of an initiation test. I wouldn't say it's as difficult as the Great Pyramid from the previous game, but it would still be at home in that title's final Atlantis chapter. This level tests pretty much all of our tomb raiding skills in a linear series of challenges with little room for error. It starts with platforming as we climb the initial hill under threat of tiger attack should we fail. It goes on to task us with finding ways to open locked doors, and then we get a marathon of traps to run from and make timed jumps over. It's a high barrier to entry, and I wouldn't be surprised if a good chunk of the 6.8 million people who bought this game back in the day never got past this opening stage. In fact, if we look at the remastered trilogy, we can see that only 29% of players have the trophy for reaching the end. We should take that with a grain of salt though, as this was released as part of a trilogy, and we can assume some people wanted to finish Tomb Raider 1 before moving on to 2. Anecdotally, this is where I encountered one of the sequel's new mechanics, zip wires, and learned, the hard way, that you have to hold the button to stay on it. Unfortunately, this oversight sent me back to the start of the level because of another change, the save system. In the console releases of Tomb Raider 1, we could only save our game at single-use save crystals, whereas the PC version allowed players to save anytime, anywhere. For Tomb Raider 2, console players got the PC save system. We can pause the game at any time and make a save. The remastered trilogy keeps the save anywhere system for all 3 entries. On the one hand, that sounds great, especially with Tomb Raider 2's increased difficulty. On the other hand, I regularly forgot to save because I didn't have the visual reminder of the crystals to prompt that decision. If it wasn't for the restart level option, it would also be possible to softlock our playthrough by making a save just as we're about to die or in a very precarious situation on low health and ammo. My only advice is to save often and to take advantage of the multiple save slots. Do not just overwrite the existing one. I usually make a fresh save at the start of each level, then use the slot below for progress through that area. It also has the fringe advantage of giving me a homemade level select at the end of the game. The game's second level, Venice, is a really interesting summary of just how different Tomb Raider 2's design philosophy is compared to the original outing. As soon as level starts, we find ourselves fighting 2 dogs and a guy with a steel pipe, while being shot at from a nearby balcony. Tomb Raider 1 saw us primarily fighting animals. We only took down a total of 5 human enemies, 6 if we want to stretch that definition to Natla, but this sequel sees us gun down Bartoli's entire criminal organisation. This gives combat an inherently different rhythm, requiring a change in tactics. It's no longer about staying out of a fast animal's melee range, it's now about blasting away at foes who also have projectile weapons that are seemingly hit-scan based. We can't really dodge or weave around them, we just have to accept that taking some damage is inevitable while chewing through medic packs. I certainly found it to be less engaging in that regard. Combine that with how much more frequently fights occur and how much higher the enemy count per encounter is, and it's easy to see why people say Tomb Raider 2 is more action-focused than its predecessor. We can't really plan around or optimize our approach either, as enemy spawns take the form of gotcha moments. Take these back-to-back instances in Bartoli's hideout. We can see, through this window, that there are no enemies in this building, but the moment we step inside, a guy spawns in behind us. Immediately after that, we go to leave the area, and another thug opens the door, surprising us while we're in water and can't immediately fight back. Sure, we get a wider variety of bigger guns in an attempt to level the playing field, but the constant battles were exhausting, and antithetical to Tomb Raider's deal. Lara's definitely not the first person to set foot in these tombs that were otherwise abandoned for thousands of years, and that melancholy sense of foreboding isolation is nowhere to be seen. Even when we're 40 fathoms deep, we're constantly encountering Bartoli's goons. How many submarines did he send down here? Sadly, I can only mark Tomb Raider 2's combat design as an unwelcome and frequent irritation. Venice highlights more differences in the sequel's approach. A common complaint centres around this window, found near the start. We have to shoot through it to get inside, but there's really nothing in-game to indicate that. Had I not known about it from other people's videos, I probably would have looked it up in the strategy guide and then groaned. Similar to the original second act, the city of Vilcabamba, Venice is a much more open level that gives us less direction. It also introduces our first vehicle, the speedboat. My first issue was simple. I didn't know how to control the boat. Most importantly, I didn't know how to get out of it, which is a problem as we need to sacrifice one of the level's 2 boats in order to clear mines surrounding the level's exit. Luckily, I have the original game and its manual, which shows the vehicle controls, but I couldn't see a digital equivalent in-game for everyone else to access. It turns out that dismounting requires pressing the jump button and a directional input at the same time, which is something I'd have never have guessed. We can also get a speed boost by pressing the action button, which will be important later. I know some people rage about how vehicles handle in this game, especially the snowmobile, but getting ahead of myself, I enjoyed them. I thought they handled well, were responsive, and generally fun to use. I went in expecting the worst, but once I got into the driver's seat, I quickly found myself wondering what everyone's been complaining about. Then again, I also like tank controls and unironically enjoy Sonic R, so take that with a massive pinch of salt. Bartley's Hideout is where I felt another increase in difficulty. Shortly after the level starts, we have to jump to this phalanx, which will slide down. We have to grab the edge before we fall, shimmy across until we have our back facing a balcony, and then immediately backflip. Then, following a long jump, we have to leap. We just leap. Screw it, we awkwardly drop into a building. This is a kind of mechanical mastery that was previously the sole territory of secret areas, this one putting me in mind of St. Francis Folly and its intimidating series of vertical hops. Bartley's Hideout continues this trend. As to progress, we have to push a block that looks exactly the same as the surrounding walls. Now, the original Citizen also had a camouflaged block like this, but it was again to access a secret area. Here, it's mandatory for progression. This is probably a good time to discuss how Tomb Raider 2 handles secrets. In the first game, secrets were normal item pickup, such as health and ammo, with a varying amount per level. They could also be absolutely devious to find. In Tomb Raider 2, there are consistently 3 secrets per level in the form of jade, silver, and gold dragon statues. This time, we're only given tangible, useful rewards when we've collected all 3 secrets. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, there's now a clear expectation. We know how many secrets are left to find. On the other hand, it forces us into an all-or-nothing situation, as we don't get any rewards for finding just 1 or 2 secrets. There's then an argument to be made that if we're really good enough to consistently find all 3 secrets, then we don't need the extra items that only a full set provides. Their placement is also odd. The silver dragon in Bartley's Hideout was the first to trip me up. I could see it on a balcony opposite me, but I couldn't figure out how to get over there. It turned out I had to use a secret door further into the level, so my earlier visibility of it was just a red herring. The gold dragon for the very first level is a highlight. Instead of taking the zipline to the level's exit, we have to manually climb down the cliff we're on and fight not just 1, but 2 T-Rexes, with our reward being a very early game grenade launcher. Outside of some few and far between instances though, many of the secret statues felt uneventful. I would walk into a normal room as part of a sage's standard progression, and there would just be a statue right there. I found a lot of these accidentally while looking for the normal path forwards. Finding a secret certainly lacks the event status or challenge of the first Tomb Raider, which is odd given that this game is generally harder overall. Returning to Bartley's Hideout, after some precision-timed jumps over flaming pipes, we enter a platforming challenge that I accidentally sequence broke, earning me a trophy. Apparently, I was supposed to go up into the rafters and rearrange the platforms before getting this key. Oops. I did this again in a later level, Living Quarters, apparently skipping an entire room. Again, I didn't know about the skip or the trophy prior to this, so the trophy was a cool way for the game to both inform and reward me, even if it admittedly made me question what I had missed out on. The trophies are pretty well designed overall, with many of them making us wonder how to get them. For example, completing Venice without using a boat or retrieving our guns without entering the water in the offshore rig. It points us to things that even longtime fans of the game might not have known were possible. I respect these kind of novelty awards that shine a light on lesser known mechanics and tricks. That said, while I greatly enjoyed my time with Tomb Raider 2, I can't see myself trying to get all of the trophies. Some, such as the 6-hour speedrun, would require an entire additional playthrough, while others, like shooting every pane of glass with Bartoli's initials on, just sound like a chore. Back on the trail, we arrive at the Opera House, and man, this level is a real mixed bag. It took me a while, and multiple deaths, to figure out the series of jumps needed for this opening area, only to come face to face with a locked door. Great. There's a switch on the opposite side of this room which, no joke, took me an hour to find. That then opens a hatch that we have to jump past a deadly swinging box to reach, which in turn has the key we needed. I can't decide if this is a case of the game being overly obtuse or whether I'm just an idiot. Let me know in the comments, did this section stump you on your first playthrough? Did you find the switch without consulting a guide? After a quick linear jumping section, we find ourselves on the roof of the Opera House. There's a strange room here that's just a slide into a spike trap. There doesn't seem to be anything in here, no items, no shortcuts, just death. At least the original waited until Egypt before it started trolling us like this. The roof also teases the location of the Golden Dragon. I quite like when the level design allows you to see earlier and later sections like this. There's always a sense of, oh, that's where I am. Neat. The interior is the game's first hub and spoke level. We have a central room, the stage, with various corridors splitting off from it. These then give us the items and levers we need to progress. These stages are often a highlight of Tomb Raider games, provided we can find the first thread to pull on easily enough. For the most part, the Opera House succeeds. I did think I was soft-locked in an area under the stage for a while, until I used the flares, another new mechanic for the sequel, to light up the rooms and found a switch that opened an exit. Highlights include jumping around deadly spinning fans in the ventilation shafts, going backstage for some platforming around the rigging, and the sense of satisfaction that comes with getting our bearings and sense of direction as we unravel the level. Unfortunately, the area ends on a whimper. We enter a boss fight that I wouldn't have known was intended to be a boss had its health bar not appeared on screen. I would have assumed it was just another henchman otherwise. I then couldn't find a way to open the exit and fumbled around for a while, even switching back to the classic graphics to see if anything became easier to see, before finding this button here which, in hindsight, should have been obvious to me. It's kind of funny how this level came full circle for me. It started with me being unable to find a simple button, and it ended the same way. Maybe I need to book an appointment at the optician's. Now we come to a section of the game that my buddy Harry, aka Video Games Are Bad, check out his channel, warned me about. The oil platform and the sunken ship beneath it. The offshore rig was actually pretty decent. We start in a cell without our guns. Yeah, it's one of those levels. Thankfully, it's not as aimless as Natla's mines. As soon as we're out of our cage, guards will run at us. With no way to defend ourselves, we leap into the water. That leads us to a series of tunnels that bring us out next to the plane we arrived in. A switch on the wall here opens the bottom hatch of the plane, somehow, so we can swim in and press another button to stop the propeller blades on the wing. Now, while I take issue with the jump to the wing, how, despite the directions the game is giving us, it looks impossible, and the extremely obvious graphical object clipping that it results in, I do applaud the overall design and conveyance of this section of the game. We know where to go and what to do in order to get our guns back. The rest of the stage involves getting coloured keycards while mowing down waves of enemies and retrieving our other weapons. Highlights include a fun platforming section across suspended walkways and a water displacement puzzle to reach the finish. The diving area feels like it's simply the offshore rig part 2. There are a few noteworthy moments though. There's a somewhat dodgy jump over acid, which forces us to ignore our instincts of reaching for the ledge. The level's verticality means it has a ladder climb that gave me flashbacks of Snake Eater, and a cool piece of in-level storytelling as a helicopter takes off before we can reach it. One puzzle is particularly odd. We need to raise a saw blade to grab a keycard from under it. It reminded me of the conveyor belt from Natla's mine, where the fuse was right there, but we couldn't just grab it. Lara, what gives? As we approach the end of the level, we can overhear Bartley interrogating a monk. It gives the impression that we're listening in while our foes have no idea we're there. Just, don't approach the monk straight away, as that triggers a cutscene in the end of the level. Go in the room behind him and get the level's final secret first. 40 Fathoms starts us underwater with a depleting oxygen meter and facing the wrong way. It's also where the graphical differences between the original release and this remaster put us at a disadvantage. See, in its original presentation, the seafloor was littered with barrels that caught our eye and led us to the next area. In the remaster, the extra vegetation hides the barrels, taking away our breadcrumb trail. Thankfully, once we're inside the sunken Maria Doria, we can surface for air and run around. I'm not sure how the vessel has any areas that aren't completely flooded, but I will suspend my disbelief for the sake of not having to spend this entire chapter swimming. Likewise, I'll just ignore the implications of Lara running around barefoot on clearly wet and rusted metal. And maybe I won't question how many submarines Marco sent down here, given the legion of his henchmen we'll find ourselves fighting. To be fair to 40 Fathoms, it's got a nice and balanced mixture of combat, platforming, and a neat timed puzzle over some flaming vents. Once we know where to go in that terrible introduction, the rest of the level is actually pretty decent. Now we come to the wreck of the Maria Doria, which is interesting in a few ways. First of all, we finally get a visual break from the same orange and blue hued textures we've been seeing since the offshore rig. It's also here that it becomes most apparent that the Maria Doria sank upside down, with us running around the ceiling. I also adore the idea of a sunken cruise ship as a tomb. It's probably not the kind of environment we immediately think of, but it fits the criteria. Second of all, this level reminded me of Tomb Raider 1's Palace Midas. That was a hub and spoke level where we needed to find 3 gold bars. This time we need 3... I'm not sure what these are actually, but instead of a hub and spoke design, we complete a circuit around the boat. The problem is that if we miss one of the objects we need, any search means repeating the loop, which is exactly what happened to me. The final... what are these? Circuit breakers. Thank you, inventory screen. Anyway, the last one is actually right at the start behind some glass doors. If we open those doors, they swing open in a way that blocks our access to the circuit breaker. Thankfully, at the very end of our run around the ship, we open up a ventilation shaft that allows us to keep these doors closed, drop down behind them, and grab our prize. It would be a fun puzzle if it was clear that the last circuit breaker was there. This was a case where I saved, stopped, consulted the 90s strategy guide, rolled my eyes, loaded the game back up, and felt a tad deflated. It's not just me either. My best friend, who has played Tomb Raider 2 before and says it's his favourite game in the franchise, sent me a voice note saying he couldn't find the last breaker. I replied asking, "Is it this one?" and a few minutes later, got a thank you from him. This confusion significantly contributed to the level massively overstaying its welcome at a whopping 90 minutes. Another fatigue factor was that, unlike Palace Midas, the level doesn't end after placing the 3 circuit breakers, continuing on for another 20 minutes, a lot of which was spent swimming around looking for an underwater key that blends in a little too well with its surroundings. This is another example where switching to the classic graphics helped a little. There was less vegetation obscuring the key, but it's still the same colour as the seabed, making it hard to spot. That irritation sadly bled into living quarters. It opens with Lara trapped underwater, putting us on a timer before she drowns. There is a switch on a wall behind us, but we need to swim against the current to reach it, and it does, of course, blend into the scenery. Once inside, things don't improve. Living Quarters brings back the blues and rusty oranges that I was already bored of 2 levels ago, making it visually unappealing. While the level is generally fine, it's also unremarkable. I made very few notes as I jumped around, chewed through medipacks while fighting hit-scan enemies, and found myself feeling generally apathetic. There's nothing wrong with this stage, but there's also nothing memorable about it. I'd be surprised if anyone disliked it, but it's also not going to be anyone's favourite. It strikes me as a level that returning players forget exists until they encounter it again, and in a section of the game that's already long in the tooth, I could make a strong argument to cut it entirely in order to improve the pacing of Tomb Raider 2 as a whole. Then we come to the deck, my Natla's Mines of Tomb Raider 2, in that I simply could not find the first thread to pull on. I ran around for a good 20 minutes, did an accidental sequence break, which sadly didn't help in the long run, and again resigned myself to that 90s strategy guide. So what was the problem? Why doesn't the opening of this level work? Put simply, we're given too big of an area to explore with too little direction. We're presented with an entire deck of the cruise ship, a cave below, a small tunnel, and a broken off chunk of the boat, with very little of that being of immediate use to us. I did find the stern key early on, which was that all-important first thread, but I couldn't find a door to use it on, making it worthless. My little sequence break admittedly didn't help matters, as it gave me yet another red herring to contend with. The solution becomes a needle in a haystack. What we need to do is swan dive off the side of the deck, swim to shore, grab the stern key, so at least I got one part right, run around the side of this structure, and then rearrange these crates to reveal the door that the key is for. Maybe it's just me being an idiot, but I don't think I would have found that door on my own. There was nothing in the level's layout or environment's design that drew sufficient attention to these crates. We then have this infamous dinghy. We need the key from it, but for some reason Lara can't just pull herself up onto it. Instead, we have to go through the cave system to get above the float, and lower ourselves down in a drop that takes off around 85% of our health. The developers knew what they had done, as there's a full heal right next to the drop. My question is, why apply this band-aid solution when they could have just made the area with the hole lower, meaning we wouldn't fall as far? The level then has an anticlimactic ending. We finally open the storage area containing the Seraph, the thing we dove down here looking for, so I made a save, fully expecting a boss fight. Disappointingly, the level ends the moment we pick up the artifact, with no final showdown in sight. Harry's graph was right. This whole section of the game dips in quality, goes on for far too long, and then just sort of fizzles out with a whimper. Following this, Lara returns to the offshore rig, takes the same plane she arrived in, and flies to Tibet. I wonder what the game would have been like if they had cut this pit stop and gone straight from Opera House to the Tibetan foothills. In what might be an unpopular opinion, I love the Tibetan foothills. This leg of the game felt like a true return to form and massively improved my opinion of the sequel as a whole. We're back in the open air, exploring a natural environment and being attacked by massive birds that can shove us off precarious ledges to our inevitable doom. Oh, and let's not overlook Lara's amazing jacket. This is Tomb Raider. Now I know the snowmobile is a common cause for complaints, but as alluded to earlier, I loved it. It has an incredibly small turning circle, being able to spin on a dime when stationary. We get to do a lot of cool jumps and slides, and the controls just made sense to me as a tank controls apologist. If the complaints come from the same people who bemoan Tomb Raider 3's buggies, then I now find myself actively looking forward to those vehicles too. I do have one complaint about this level, and that's what I consider to be a mini-boss fight. We get attacked by an enemy on a snowmobile, only their one has mounted guns. It took me an embarrassing number of retries before finally being able to take this foe out. While we can then ride this black snowmobile, its guns replace the original snowmobile's boost, and trust me, we need the maneuverability more. I also messed up the final swan dive, doing a normal jump instead. I'm pretty sure I should have died as Lara's foot clipped the ground, but the game let me get away with it, so yay for me, I guess. That brings us to the Barkang Monastery, which, no joke, might just be the best Tomb Raider level ever made. This is another hub and spoke level where we'll be branching off from and returning to this impressive central chamber to collect 5 prayer wheels in order to open the exit. But before we can do that, we have to address the elephant in the room, the hostile monks. A lot of people complain that if you shoot any monk too many times, the entire monastery will become hostile, and the level becomes borderline impossible. This is often touted as unfair because how are we, as players, reasonably supposed to know? I completely disagree with this. I think it's communicated well. I want us to keep 3 facts in mind. 1, at the start of the level, we can see an ongoing fight between Bartoli's men and the monks. 2, we have been fighting Marco's henchmen throughout the entire game thus far. 3, we have met a monk at the end of the diving area level, where it was made very clear that the monks are friendly towards Lara and hostile towards Bartoli. Maybe it's because I'm not American, and therefore not in the business of turning up late to someone else's fight, firing the final few shots, and proclaiming myself the hero. But why, given that context, would we choose to shoot the monks? Now, I do agree that Lara's auto-aim can target the monks, and it's not always clear who we're pointing our guns at when there are clusters of people close together, as is often the case here. We can accidentally shoot the monks whenever they're in a fight with Marco's men, but that's not how people tend to present the argument. Unless we're going for the trophy for keeping every monk alive, we're better off letting the brothers fight for us, only intervening to finish off Bartoli's goons if they wipe out our friends. See? British. In fact, one section of this level seemingly relies on us using that exact tactic, as I was consistently shot to ribbons without my enlightened backup. Back to praising this level up and down. It's a wonderfully balanced and varied affair that tests all of our acrobatic skills, our combat prowess, and our logical problem-solving capabilities. It expertly teases solutions and future sections, such as these movable blocks underwater, communicating that we need to drain the pool at some point. The main example of this is the central golden statue. The moment I saw it, I hoped I would get to climb and jump across it. Sure enough, we get to do exactly that. The visual variety is off the charts. We have the snowy exterior walls that we climb in order to get into the main building, the warm oranges, browns and golds of the interior, and the ornate stonework of the rooftop. It all looks fantastic in the remaster too, having been lovingly updated. It's a stage that every Tomb Raider fan needs to experience, serving as a near-perfect microcosm of the original series' unique blend of gameplay styles and charm. It was easily the standout experience of my time with this entry. My only complaint is the ending. We approach a massive golden disc resembling a vault door, we place a seraph we found aboard the Maria Doria in this slot, and instead of the disc rolling away, a small door opens to our right. Maybe I guessed the original intent correctly, but project limits, be that time, technology, what have you, got in the way, and this was the next best thing. Still, kind of a letdown. The next 2 levels see us exploring an ancient temple for our second key, the one that will open the door back at the Great Wall of China. Straight away, the catacombs of the Talion and the Ice Palace made me feel like I was back in the original game's opening Peru levels. This was partly through the aesthetic, lots of snow and old stone walls, but primarily through its distillation of Tomb Raider's winning formula. There's minimal fat to these stages, despite it arguably being one giant environment that, like its predecessor's Car Moon, had to be chopped into 2, presumably due to limitations imposed by the original PlayStation. It revolves around this bowl of lava suspended above a block of ice. We need to drop the lava to melt the ice and grab a hammer that's currently frozen under it. Now, I didn't know this was a 2-part level at first, so when I reached the dish, I started looking for ways to tip or drop it to no avail, eventually giving up and moving on. Strangely, when I returned here in Ice Palace, the bowl was seemingly empty. I'm not sure if the effects just failed to render, or whether it loaded the post-tipped state, but it certainly looked odd. Thankfully, I was still able to progress. So, first and foremost, the positives. I love interconnected stages. Being able to see or revisit parts of the previous level always sends a chill up my spine. The catacombs have a tense area where we're in pitch darkness, and lighting a flare reveals we're locked in with yetis. We instinctively know that pulling the switch ahead is the only way forward, but it will also let the beasts out of their cages. The Ice Palace caps this section off with a boss fight, and while like a lot of bosses in Tomb Raider, we just need to blast away at it while keeping our distance, it's better than the no-show we got on the Maria Doria. I also had a hilarious moment where I accidentally backflipped off the edge of the stage while landing the killing blow, causing Lara to fall to her death, but the game countered it as clearing the level anyway. I sat laughing at this results screen for a good 10 minutes. Now for the sole negative, these bouncing pads introduced in the Ice Palace. It's really hard to gauge how far we will bounce, and with this game's fall damage, mistakes are deadly. We're introduced to these in a somewhat safe environment, but the training wheels are quickly removed. Sadly, they briefly return in the next level, Temple of Xi'an, where they're equally as awful. After a casual 46-hour drive from Tibet to the Great Wall of China, no big deal, Lara finds herself back at the same door from the game's opening level, our trip around the world concluding where we started. The game wants to troll us one last time. As we approach our prize, the Dagger of Xi'an, the floor collapses beneath us. What follows is one of the largest and greatest Tomb Raider levels I have ever had the privilege of playing, as we climb our way back to the top. This level has everything. Perilous platforming over pits of molten lava, frantic sprints across spinning obstacles, collapsing platforms, closing gates, and boulders for good measure, plus the classic brain-teasing puzzles and death traps we've come to expect from the series. It tests all of our abilities across a variety of beautiful backdrops. We move from caves into ornate buildings, and even a den of giant spiders. It constantly feels fresh, with routes that form loops and weave into each other naturally. I'm not going to spoil this level too much, because I think every Tomb Raider fan deserves to experience it for themselves, but I would like to discuss some of its highs and lows. There's a water puzzle that had me stumped for a while. I knew I had opened a door, but I couldn't figure out where that door was or how to reach it. After about 20 minutes of repeating the same steps, I consulted the strategy guide, only to find it was annoyingly simple. One of the first levers changes the water level, and we just have to raise it again to find the newly unlocked door. I'm willing to accept that I might just be stupid when it comes to this one. I was confused when I hopped across some platforms and up a ladder to reach a medipack, only to unlock a trophy for getting what was described as an unreachable item. I asked around about this, and it turns out that in the original releases of Tomb Raider 2, this ladder didn't work, so players couldn't get up here without glitches. And then there's something every Tomb Raider 2 reviewer complains about: this final ladder climb. To avoid this blade, we have to jump and roll in the air to face the other way and grab another ladder behind us. That would be fine if the technique was ever taught to us. Like the flares for lighting up dark areas, the zip lines, the vehicle controls as a whole, and our ability to even climb ladders in the first place, this is a new technique that the game never teaches us. The only time it's been required before now, including at the very start of this same level, is for accessing optional secrets. Not only do we not know that we can tumble in the air, we might not realise there's another ladder behind us in the first place. We briefly see it during a mandatory backflip to dodge an earlier blade, but even in a 16:9 aspect ratio, it's not in the camera's view when we need to leap to it. Were it not for this section's notoriety online for being unfair, I wouldn't have known the solution, would have gone back to that 90s strategy guide, and then angrily shouted, "How was I supposed to know that?" It's also the last room of the entire stage, so I wonder how many people give up here, not realising they're just a few seconds away from reaching the end. In which we see Marco casually stroll up to and stab himself with the dagger before being carried away. Hang on, how come the trapdoor didn't activate for him? We now find ourselves in the floating islands. No, not those ones. This is a gorgeous ethereal area of glowing jade rock suspended over a bottomless pit. It's also a level that took me just over 80 minutes to beat, during which time I became greatly frustrated with the game. First, let's talk enemies, both in design and quantity. Alongside Bartoli's thugs, we now have to contend with ancient warriors who burst from stone, can fly, and who will decimate our health bar in seconds. There's one particular section where we're dumped in a pit against both Marco's cult and these mysterious guardians. There are more human enemies in this single encounter than there were in the entirety of the previous game. Oh, and we have to watch where we jump and dodge to, as there are pits of instant kill lava all over the place. It is, without a doubt, one of the worst rooms in franchise history. Even a grenade launcher won't save us here. It is a culmination of everything that is wrong with Tomb Raider 2's combat design. Even basic navigation is difficult. I was stuck at the very start of the stage. I just could not find the route forward. In the end, it turned out we're supposed to head to the edge of one of the area's larger platforms, hang off the edge, and drop to a hidden cave under it. There is nothing to draw our attention to it or make us think that anything would be there, let alone the mandatory path for progression. This level does have its moments, though. Making a running swan dive towards a wall of fire in order to land in a small pool of water was particularly fantastic, a word that fittingly describes the otherworldly aesthetic of this bizarre and memorable area. It's just a shame the gameplay frustrations outweighed the genuinely awe-inspiring presentation. This is followed by the Dragon's Lair, possibly the game's shortest level. We are faced with 2 combat arenas and the final boss fight with the now transformed Marco Bartoli. Once the dragon's health gets low, it will lay on its side and start healing itself. All we have to do is run up and remove the dagger of Xian to turn Marco into a pile of dragon bones. A solution that's shown to us in the game's opening cutscene, although I'm not sure how Lara would have known. This was really underwhelming and disappointing. The level took me less than 7.5 minutes to beat on my first playthrough. That's kind of pathetic for a grand finale, or at least it would be if we didn't have one more level to go. Home Sweet Home has been hyped up as the greatest ending to any Tomb Raider game ever, one of the most satisfying completion rewards ever put to code, a shining example of how to create an empowering victory lap, and one of Lara's greatest moments. I love the concept. The remnants of Bartoli's gang make a midnight raid on Croft Manor. It's unclear whether they intend to retrieve the dagger, get revenge for their boss, or achieve a little bit of both, but one thing is clear, Lara won't stand for it. We go to the gun cupboard, grab our trusty shotgun, and show these invaders a little hospitality. I was sadly disappointed when things came to an abrupt end after just 6 minutes then, following another boss fight that I wouldn't have known was a boss had it not been for the remaster giving the thug a dedicated health bar. Yes, the idea is great. Sure, it makes perfect sense from a story perspective. I do like the idea of Lara's actions having personal consequences. I love that the game ends where it began in the familiar tutorial area. And okay, that final scene where Lara breaks the fourth wall, shooting us as a player, is iconic. And not in the overused and bastardized manner that gets tossed around. Truly iconic, and again, an awakening for a dear friend of mine. But the gameplay simply doesn't back it up. If these guys wanted revenge, they should have brought bigger guns and more men, or at least considered some form of coordination. Enemy placements seemed sparse and random, with me just so happening to end up having the final battle in the back garden. That sudden jarring cut from there to the bathroom felt sloppy and bizarre. I wouldn't be surprised if I've spent as much time talking about this finale as I did playing through it. I'm sorry if that upsets some people, however, I feel that while this stage may have been cool and novel, it was ultimately superficial and simply did not live up to its own legend. Let's switch tracks to something more positive. The game's presentation is, thankfully, stunning. I spent a lot of time swapping between the new and original graphics, and feel the remaster did a fantastic job of enriching these environments while largely respecting the old assets. There are certainly areas where colours and details have been changed, sometimes for the worse. I think everyone has pointed out the triple-nostrilled dragon door in the late game, but for the most part, this new treatment seems to be an improvement. I'm particularly impressed with the faux 3D ladders that appear to imply depth through clever use of parallax. I understand the implementation was different and potentially nauseating at launch, but by the time I got to my playthrough, patches had significantly improved things. There are some inconsistencies in what did and didn't receive new models. These log bridges getting considerably more attention than most other assets did. It can almost seem random as to what got replaced, what was merely touched up, and what was seemingly left as it always was. One area that has a gameplay impact is the new lighting, with some pitch black areas that required flares to navigate in the previous releases now being lit. I certainly had a surplus of flares throughout the adventure, finding myself rarely needing them. There are other minor things that bugged me, such as the oddly massive timer in the assault course at Lara's home, or the red inventory background being replaced with a black void, though I understand that last one has since been patched and fixed. I don't have any nostalgia for the original models and textures, largely because I didn't play the 90s release of Tomb Raider 2, but the original Tomb Raider was one of my favourite games growing up. I very much have rose-tinted glasses for that game, and the remaster's visual treatment of Lara's first outing got a big thumbs up from me. My best friend considers Tomb Raider 2 his favourite, and he's also very happy with how this remaster treats the game's visuals, so I think it's safe to say that the team did a good job. So, despite being 27 years late to the party, how do I feel about Tomb Raider 2 now that I've completed it? Pretty good. It's not my favourite, I don't know what Richie is on when he says it's the best one in his eyes, but it is a good time. There is a larger focus on combat, and because those fights are largely against human enemies with guns of their own, it often seems like there's little we can do except to chew through healing items and hope for the best. The underwater combat, in particular, is so finicky that I largely ignored it, choosing to avoid foes instead. That leads into my second and biggest complaint. The vibe is entirely changed. While the first outing was isolating, mysterious, and lonely, bordering on horror at times, the sequel is an action movie race against another treasure hunter. We're very much not alone. We're not the first to set foot in these ancient, forgotten ruins. We are, instead, besieged on all sides at all times. Our success also relies on new mechanics and movesets that the game simply doesn't teach us, outside of a manual that the remaster fails to provide an equivalent of. A new player coming in today is essentially forced to Google key controls, which should never be the case. Finally, the story is borderline non-existent. As I said, we never learn much about Marco, and I don't think he and Lara exchange a single word, just a couple of bullets. It's also filled with contrivances, especially the aligned timing of Lara and Marco's hunts, with a midsection of the Maria Doria that outstays its welcome while feeling largely inconsequential. On the plus side, this was more classic Tomb Raider that was new to me. It provided a mostly fair challenge that built on the skills I had learned in the original game. In many ways, picking up the difficulty curve where Tomb Raider 1 left off, and escalating the stakes made it feel less like a sequel and more like an expansion pack, which is odd given that the original trilogy got traditional expansion packs on PC back in the day. I honestly expected to have a much harder time with this game, given its reputation. I'd been led to believe that the strategy guide was essential, yet only found myself reaching for it 3 or 4 times throughout my entire playthrough. It was largely fair and balanced for those who have already conquered the original adventure, but newcomers would likely struggle and become frustrated. I cannot recommend Tomb Raider 2 as someone's entry point into the series. The level design requires us to use advanced techniques very early on. The original Tomb Raider is pretty much required reading for this sequel, as that better teaches players the rules, tropes, and controls of the classic series. That said, anyone who liked Lara's first adventure and who wants more should absolutely fire up and enjoy this sequel. One downside to continuing a difficulty curve highlighted by Tomb Raider 2 is that the curve quickly flattens out. If a game starts at an 8 out of 10, it then has limited opportunities to raise the stakes, and that can cause the experience to feel stale at times. Fortunately, Tomb Raider 2's varied gameplay prevents this from becoming a bigger issue, and the experience remains enjoyable throughout. But it certainly serves as a warning to other franchises looking to take a similar approach to designing a sequel's challenge. In the modern day, the dilemma of difficulty curves in sequels is somewhat resolved by the advent of downloadable content. DLC can assume a player is familiar with the base game and ramp up the challenge, confident that the core audience will be returning players, the modern day equivalent of old school expansion packs. While I am concerned about how DLC will be preserved, no game is guaranteed to have a complete edition re-release, and even those that do often include the DLC as a one-time use code instead of including the content on the disc, I am happy that players like me are catered to more frequently. This remaster also presents the best and most convenient way to play this title. It's available on every currently supported platform at a very reasonable price. It's also the first console release to include the extra levels from the Golden Mask, which I might talk about separately as a combined review of all three games' expansions. We also have the choice to toggle between the new and original visual assets if we decide we don't like the new presentation. We then have a choice between the classic tank controls or a modernised scheme based on Tomb Raider's Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld. For me, this is a textbook example of a remaster that can serve as a replacement for the original. Thank you, this has been a long one. Here are some recommendations for my other videos. If you've enjoyed this one enough to stick around, then you're sure to love these too. I would also like to thank my Patreon supporters who are Crow, Tiny Jericho, Mr. Terry Chaos, Duckygo, Francis T218, and Deliberator. You can join them for perks such as pre-release video scripts in the link in the description. You can also support the channel for free by liking, commenting, and subscribing.